The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.
Well, thank you very much for coming. This is ought to be a very short introduction to Michael Storper, our speaker. If you look online at his resume, it is some 42 pages long. He has an extraordinary distinguished career as a scholar, both here in the States and in Europe. He's now a professor of economic geography at UCLA. But we're here not to investigate what his lifetime of scholarship is, but rather the book that's being framed here, the rise and fall of urban economies, lessons from San Francisco and Los Angeles. Two quick testimonials. There have been, in my lifetime, there's been two executive directors of SCAG, Southern California Association of Governments, Mark Pisano, Asana Prada. Both of them told me separately that the single best book they ever read on what has taken place or what has not taken place in Southern California is this book by Michael Storper. It's a book that, at least online, says was 5 years in the writing, a lot of different sources. Some of the best colleagues have been involved in its evolution, and I think for our region, this really is an important evening. If you look at the book, the rise from 1970 was San Francisco. The fall from 1970 was Los Angeles. Again, distinguished international scholar, respected professor at UCLA, and our guest tonight, Michael Storper.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to hear about this research that we did. This is actually the book. It's prettier in reality than on the slide. The colors didn't come out. So, and it's from Stanford University Press. It is the result of a long research project that we were very fortunate to have supported by the John Randolph Haynes and Dora Haynes Foundation, who gave us a grant and have supported us in other ways. The book is expensive now, but in a few months there will be a paperback version, and it'll get cheaper and more accessible. So this is the starting point for the book, and what this shows is probably the simplest indicator, the cleanest indicator of the degree of prosperity of a region. And I'll tell you, we can put some bells and whistles on it in a minute, but it's a stripped down indicator that shows you clearly how well a region is doing. It is per capita personal income. Basically, you take the economic output of a region, you divide it by the number of people, and you get this number. And what you can see is that the two regions, and we'll talk about what we mean by region, but to give you the shorthand, when I say San Francisco here, I mean the 10-county San Francisco Bay Area, and when I say LA, I mean the 5-county Southern California region. So these are regional figures that you're seeing here. And in 1970, our regions were very close to being identical in their levels of prosperity. What you see on that slide today is a 30% difference, which is enormous. It's basically the difference between what you might call a very high-income region and now what we are here in Southern California, which is slipping into the ranks of what we might call middle-income regions. This gives you a ranking. So on this table, what you see in the first column is the top 10 American metropolitan regions. There are 337 metropolitan regions in the United States of America. This takes the 10 richest ones in 1970, and you can see that the Bay Area is number 1 and LA is number 4 in 1970. And the difference in our incomes at that time was 4%. Basically, they were identical. Now, flip over to 2009, but I have them for 2012, it's the same. We are number 25. Okay, so that is in the history of regions, that's a precipitous, very very disquieting drop in rank. And you can see a couple of other cases on that chart which are steep drops in performance. For example, Detroit. Detroit was the 6th richest American metropolitan region in 1970, and it became number 52. Cleveland went from 9 to 36. So those are the really the poorly performing regions there. Now, the reason that we're not comparable, this is the good news, to Detroit and Cleveland, you can find that in the third column, which is when you think about the dynamic of a metropolitan region, you have to think about two basic variables. One is the income variable, but the other is the population variable. And there are many different combinations of these things. So here with the Bay Area and LA, we're dealing with two metropolitan areas that have had a lot of population growth. So what we don't want to do is compare LA and San Francisco we don't want to directly compare them to regions with low population growth or even population loss. It's a different dynamic to try and produce income over a rapidly increasing population as opposed to maintaining it over a stable or decreasing one. And you can see lots of combinations there, and that is, by the way, how the nation's urban system works. If you take the 337, you'll see all kinds of different combinations. What I'm interested in, to put my cards on the table, is the quality of growth, principally. And the quality of growth is about income. You can bring in many, many people, but if you don't give them the possibility to earn decent incomes, we could say, I think, that you're having a lot of growth, but it's not very high in quality. And I can tell you some stories about other cities in our urban system that represent different cases there. But for example, let's see, on this chart you see cities like New York. New York had it actually did have some population growth, 13% in a region that was already as big as New York in 1970 means that they took in a couple million people. That's real population growth. And New York did quite well at maintaining per capita income. But it's not in the same league as say San Francisco and LA. But have a look at the Washington D.C. area. Washington D.C. area is a very high population growth region, and it goes from being number 5 to number 2. So it's resolutely more successful than, say, LA. That's the bigger picture of that combination of those two variables. And what you see up in the upper left-hand corner there is the cities with high incomes but not very high population growth. You see on the upper right, one of our cases, San Francisco, with high population growth and high income growth. And you see also a case I'll refer to again, Houston. And I'll throw this out there right now. Houston is probably the most successful American metropolitan region in the early 21st century because Houston is combining high population growth and becoming a high-income metropolitan region. That's not true of most of the metropolitan areas in the South and the Southwest, which you see, for example, over in the lower right-hand quadrant there, where you get a lot of population growth, but not very good performance on income. People are coming in, but the opportunities, at least compared to the national standard of opportunity, are not very good. And then you see, lower left-hand, you see the problem of cities that are doing well on neither of these variables, and we definitely don't want, no city would want to be there. Okay, so now let's just talk, to get into the subject, to make sure that we have the parameters down, because this often comes up, and I said it once, but let's repeat it. These are these two entire metropolitan regions. The Bay Area with about 7.8 million residents, and I'm saying LA, I don't mean to be offensive out here, but this is greater LA, 17.8 million residents. And again, those are the figures on divergence. And why do we want to look at this scale? Of course, within these vast metropolitan regions, there are subregions. There are, we might say, sort of like there are mountains in the overall plane of concentration of interaction. But fundamentally, the reason we look at a region-wide level is because that's the area at which the labor market is integrated through high degrees of overlapping commuting between the various job centers and the various areas of residence. And what that does is it gives the regional economy a high degree of interactivity in the key things that we look at in economics, which is the price of labor, the price of land, the supply of labor, the supply of land, and the activity matrix, meaning the industries or activities that we have. So fundamentally, an economy, it deploys itself at this regional scale. Now, a little perspective here. Greater LA was by most measures the most successful American metropolitan region for the first 2/3 of the 20th century. Indeed, around the world, LA was considered to be an astonishing story of economic development. To remind everyone, our biggest and oldest metropolitan region at the end of the 19th century was San Francisco, because it had become the capital during the California gold rush in the 19th century, and it was both bigger and it was also wealthier than Southern California if you looked to 1890, 1900. What happens is that the situation turns around with the latecomer region, meaning this one, Southern California, coming up both in terms of population and in terms of wealth during the 20th century. So from 1910 to 1970, we have a 21-fold growth in our population, and we move up from being a moderate income region to being a wealthy region. And so what that is a story of generating lots of opportunity and high quality opportunity. Of course, bearing in mind that there is a nostalgia about that, because we say widespread, inclusive opportunity. I think we should always remember, of course, that it was also a story of racial and ethnic inequality and exclusion during those days. That having been said, there was sort of a general regional dynamic that was pretty good, okay, with that caveat. So now, let's just dig a little bit more into this statement I'm making about these two regions, because there's a few details that one needs to think about. So first of all, one reaction that many people have right off the bat is, oh yeah, well, incomes might be lower in Southern California, but the cost of housing is a lot higher in the Bay Area, and therefore maybe people aren't really better off in the Bay Area because all that extra income would be going for housing costs. That is partially true, but it comes nowhere near to effacing this per capita income difference that we observe. It takes off some of it, but when one digs into the dynamics of the housing market, and when you break down the population and you match it to the housing and their expenditures, what you find is that they're at virtually every level of the Bay Area income hierarchy. People have considerably more disposable income after housing is taken into account than their equivalents here in Southern California. Another issue you might want to consider in thinking about the two economies is how unequally distributed this income is. So think about this. What if I said the Bay Area has a high per capita income, but if more of that income were going to the people at the top, to the elite, then it could be the case that the average person in the Bay Area wouldn't be better off than the average person in Southern California, right? If the Bay Area were a lot more unequal than Southern California. This turns out to not be the case. I have good news and bad news here. The bad news is that these two regions are highly unequal compared to the United States as a whole. So the United States, as probably most people know, has had a sharp rise in income inequality since 1980. And metropolitan regions in America are generally more unequal than the country as a whole. They tend to be, but the good news is they tend to be richer than the country as a whole. So places like New York and San Francisco and Washington and Boston and even LA have higher per capita income than the country, but they're more unequal. Now, San Francisco and LA are equally unequal. For those of you who are statistics wonks in the room, you know what the Gini coefficient is. And the Gini coefficient for these two regions is 0.51, which makes us sort of like the levels of inequality that typically we observe in Latin America at a national level. So they're very unequal. Now, what it means, though, is that in the Bay Area, at any level, wherever you are in the income hierarchy of the region, whether you're a low-income person, an average low-income person, an average middle-income person, or an average high-income person, you will have a higher per capita income than your equivalent person in Southern California. That's what it means. So to put it bluntly, it's probably better to be rich and unequal than poor and unequal. And that's what we observe. Again, the geographical scale, I mentioned that, it's the two regions. Now, we also at the beginning of the project, a lot of people said to us that maybe the kind of unfavorable picture we were seeing in Southern California had to do with the borders of the region, and that really speaks to where we are now. What many people in interviews said to us, well, by an accident of geography, and also census categories of what is a region, the greater Southern California metropolitan region has a bigger border areas where incomes tend to be lower than the region as a whole, so you're going to have a bias downward in your numbers for Southern California. And those of you who know the Bay Area know that a lot of people commute into the Bay Area from areas that until 2012 were not in the Bay Area as a census category. They're from the Central Valley, basically from Stanislaus County and San Joaquin County, and people drive over the hill into the Bay Area. But if you don't include them, you might be making the Bay Area seem richer than it is, or you might be making LA seem poorer than it is. So just to reassure you, my team, what we did is we double-checked the numbers. We did them, for example, by discriminating between the parts of Riverside and San Bernardino County that heavily commute into the LA labor shed and those that are outside of it, because these are huge counties, as you know. They go all the way to the Arizona border. And we did the opposite, which is we hand-added the commuters from the Central Valley into the Bay Area and put them into the numbers. And any way you twist the numbers, you come out with a story that I've told you of this very sharp divergence in economic performance. Moreover, the difference is not just because greater Southern California is bigger. So you could think about that. You could say, well, you know, the Bay Area is a small place. The whole Bay Area has less population than just LA County. And maybe it's sort of, rich and boutiquey, but we're big and we have all these vast areas of lower income performance, and maybe that's giving us a biased picture. But that turns out to not be true either. So the wealthiest county in greater LA is Orange County, and Orange County's per capita personal income would rank it 8th out of the 10 Bay Area counties. There are 7 counties in the Bay Area that have per capita personal income that is better than Orange counties, which is our best. Moreover, if you calculate it by population, what you find is that 75% of the population of the San Francisco Bay Area lives in counties that are wealthier than any county in Southern California. So any way you twist it, the Bay Area shows up as having widespread prosperity, and we show up as having widespread distress. I could give you some more dismal calculations. For example, if you pull LA County out, LA County with 10 million people in it has a per capita income that's under $30,000 a year now. The Bay Area has a per capita income that's about $75,000 a year. LA, if we were to count it as a metropolitan region, given that it is bigger than all metropolitan regions, just LA County is bigger than all metropolitan regions except New York, right? It would rank 153rd in metropolitan, out of the 337 metropolitan regions in the United States. And remember that we have a lot of metropolitan regions in rather poor areas of this country, meaning the South. So this is a picture that is not pretty. Now, here's a consequence, and I think this is why I think we want to think about these kinds of issues. Income and human progress and welfare are not the same thing, right? There are lots of values in life and lots of elements of having a good life and being humanly fulfilled. But income in a market society like ours, it is a very important one. And it's important, it's obviously important to people's private welfare, meaning what income individuals and households have in terms of the kinds of a comfort and security and future they can assure themselves. But moreover, it's about the public sector. So as you all probably know, we have a complex tax system and a complex spending system with federal, state, and local and regional levels in it. Federal and state, there's taxes and things are passed through and moved around and transferred in very complex ways. We know that we in California are a net loser in the federal system. We contribute a lot more than we get, and a lot of areas get our money to spend. I could be a little resentful about that sometimes because I think they're not very appreciative of what we contribute. But just looking at what we tax and spend at local and regional level, the Bay Area and LA have roughly identical tax rates. Approximately 7% of their income is taxed and spent through local and regional government in the areas that those governments have authority in. The difference in per capita income that I'm documenting to you means that in 2010, the Bay Area spends per capita $25,000. Each person in the Bay Area, there's $25,000 we can spend on them. In Southern California, that figure is now 18. So that means not only do they have higher private income, but they have higher public fiscal capacity to spend on things like infrastructure, culture, health, education, community development, and all of the good things, welfare, any kind of public good that you want. They have not only higher private income, but they have a widening fiscal capacity compared to Southern California, even though we need the money more. I'm not saying that in a resentful way, that's just the way the tax system works. So, this is, in other words, what we're seeing is a story where the two regions are traveling progressively different pathways. And I want to remind you that that wasn't the case in the 20th century. In the 20th century, it was a story of LA's catch-up, convergence, and sort of equalizing the opportunities between the two regions. Okay, so that's the diagnosis. And after we did the diagnosis, we of course really wanted to know, well, why did this happen? And what I have here on this slide is the obvious things that I think anyone who lives or studies these two regions, these are the things you'd say. The Bay Area, in this period, it grows Silicon Valley, the world's high-tech core, high-tech capital of the world. The Bay Area also, it captures the new financial economy, meaning it gets a vibrant investment banking industry. It gets the growth of information technology related corporate headquarters. Those are all the household names that were small firms or unknown firms in the 60s and 70s and are now world-class names. And they're homegrown in the Bay Area, right? You name it, Apple, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, what's going on, and I'll come back to this, is the Bay Area is currently winning out in biotech, digital entertainment distribution, and apps. What happens down here is, of course, we lose a lot of aerospace and defense, which was a high-wage sector down here. We lose corporate headquarters. LA is a very paradoxical city. It's a world-sized metropolis with virtually no high-end corporate presence. It's very strange. There's no comparable city in its size class like that. Not New York, not London, not Paris, not Tokyo. Those are the comparable cities in the developed world that are more than 10 million people. We have growth in light manufacturing, but I'll show this in a minute. Light manufacturing is low wage. Our success story is Hollywood. We are more than ever the capital of content production and entertainment. Music, TV, films is more concentrated in LA County than it has ever been, which surprises a lot of people because everyone always complains that there's no work in Hollywood, but it's actually an optical illusion. We gain in transportation and logistics, as you know. We are a vast transportation infrastructure region from the ports through the railheads and out here to the logistics centers. But transportation and logistics are low to medium wage industries. And we're currently losing out in biotech. So that's sort of a start. Now, you can see that in a more technical way by looking at what we who study regional economics, we have a concept of what are the core industries and what are the locally serving industries. And the core industries are things that we concentrate and that we essentially we do them as export services for the rest of the economy. And just, I have there in yellow, you'll see sort of the story about IT, which is something we want to examine. Information technology in 1970 had an identical role, that is a proportional role in Southern California that was identical to that of Northern California. 2.6 versus 2.7% of the core employment were in these two regions. Now, if you go down to 2010, IT is still 2.7% of Southern California's economy, but it's more than 10% out of the Bay Area. So what happens is that in proportional terms, IT has a fourfold growth in the Bay Area, and it stagnates here. And I want to come back to that. You see also on the LA column the collapse of aerospace, 3.4 to 0.9%. You see the rise of logistics, 1.3 to 2.3%. You see entertainment's rise that I just referred to, 0.7 to 2.5%. And you see apparel actually declining. So, now, I want to focus for a minute on those core industries. Why are we not focusing on the majority of employment in any region is actually stuff that we call the home-based economy or the home market. That's going to the supermarket, getting your car fixed, fixing up your house, getting your hair cut. That's not the stuff that you examine to look at what is the motor of a regional economy, even though it's the majority of employment. And the reason is that it's the core industries that provide the extra, it's what we call in economics the derived demand, or the income that flows through the system and causes all those other activities to multiply. Those of you who studied regional economics, I'm using code words from the theory stuff, but it's not, the technicalities aren't important. It's just to know that focusing on the core is where you learn about where the income generation is going to come from. And now, if we compare the cores of our two economies, one way to understand why the Bay Area has a better core is this one, it's wages. So notice that this graph is almost identical to the overall income graph. This is just the wages in the core sectors of the two economies. And basically what you see there is in 1970, our cores had pretty similar wages. In 2010, the Bay Area has a high wage core, and we have kind of a medium wage core. Now, that can be confirmed in a whole bunch of other things. So we were, as regions, not so different in our overall innovativeness. That's patents. That's how many patents are issued by scientists and firms in the region. And what you see is that the Bay Area is about 10 times more innovative than we are right now. Here's another, another one. Comparing the cores of the two regions, there's actually often a problem in sort of understanding it. And it has to do with how big a microscope or how big a magnifying glass you put on it. What I mean by that is, let's say there's a lot of high tech in Orange County, and a lot of IT in Orange County, and there's a lot of IT in Santa Clara County, right? In Silicon Valley, San Mateo and Santa Clara Valley. So a lot of people say, well, yeah, we have a lot of IT and they have a lot of IT, except that they're really apples and oranges. And that has to do with digging into or within the IT to see what they do, what they're really doing. And when you do that, you find out that IT in Orange County is not doing the same things as they're doing in the Bay Area. So this is true generally of our core industries, meaning that not only is the Bay Area in general composed of core industries that pay higher wages, but within those same industries, they are engaged in more skilled work and have higher wages even within the so-called same industry. And you can see this in what are some pretty astonishing figures. So if you pull out the kinds of jobs that you do in one particular industry, this is IT. This is what the US Census Bureau says are some jobs in IT. And they're what we call very detailed job categories or occupational categories. And if you take this category, so in principle, when you look at one of these lines, you're looking at people who have the same kind of education and are doing the same kind of career path. But look at the huge differences in wages. What's going on there? Now, there's two possibilities. One is that actually they're not the same jobs. And that's probably part of it, is that we're not detailed enough. We would have to do really wonky stuff of breaking this down even more and see that within these that under these detailed categories are even more detailed differences in jobs. And the other possibility is simply that people in the Bay Area are more productive, right? Meaning, I'm a programmer and you're a programmer, but you're just better than I am, and so you get more wages. Probably it's because, for both of those reasons. Not because you're personally better than me, but you're probably working in a network or an infrastructure, a kind of business infrastructure that makes you more productive. And you're probably also doing higher order functions. But the numbers are really astonishing. Right? So this is at the level of real detail. And here's, I think, the clincher on this. So this is, I have to do a little bit of academic backfilling here. We now have a way of, so an economy, of course, is composed of thousands of different industries and hundreds of thousands of different kinds of jobs. And so when you try to analyze that and tell a kind of a broad story about it, you have the problem of how can I compare jobs and skills across this vastly complex economy. And we have a new technique in economics to do that. What we do is we characterize jobs by, first of all, whether they are manual skills or whether they are cognitive skills. And then, more importantly, we characterize them by whether the job is mostly about routines, that is, things that you repeat, Someone gives you a rule and you do the same thing over and over again, and you don't have to do a lot of personal judgment in the job, versus the jobs that are what we call non-routine, where a lot depends on the judgments made by the individual doing the job, whether it's manual or cognitive. And and we can do that for the whole economy now. So when you do that, what we did is we took all those data and we did them for the two regions as a whole, and we went back in time. And the actual, it would take too long to go into exactly what 2.5 means, so sort of take them in a comparative sense. And what you see in 1970 is that both LA and San Francisco are more skilled than the US economy as a whole. That we are, and that's reflected in the fact that in 1970, both regions had per capita income that was considerably higher than the country as a whole. So this lines up perfectly with the other set of numbers. But now look over to, those are the latest numbers we can get, because the Census Bureau kind of, they chunk them out in 10-year batches. So 2006 to 2008, LA goes, okay, first of all, note that all the numbers rise from 70 to 2010. And what that's showing is the new economy. It's showing an economy that is generally getting more skilled. That's good news. But what it shows is that LA drops below the national average. The national average rises from 2.40 to 2.95. LA drops below the national average in that intervening period. And look at what happens to the Bay Area. They're higher, like we are, and remember, almost identical in 1970, but they're much higher than the national average in the kinds of skills and jobs they're creating in the Bay Area as opposed to down here. So, now let's consider the typical story I think that people are inclined to tell to explain why the two regions are so different. And this is actually a difficult story to tell without stepping on someone's toes and offending people. And in the following sense, a kind of typical story is that we had different kinds of immigrants. Okay, and that basically, as we all know, these regions, by the way, we absorbed lots of domestic immigrants, people from other states, but most especially, we absorbed a lot of people from other countries. Today, or at least in 2012, the Bay Area and Greater LA had exactly identical proportions of foreign-born people at about 38.2%. So both regions are inclusive in the sense of taking in a lot of foreign-born people. Okay, but we also, of course, take in people from Iowa, New York, Minnesota, wherever, and we also send people. Now, a story that sort of instinctive story that people like to tell is that LA got more foreign immigrants who were lower in skill than the Bay Area. And this is actually true. So it's a starting point. The Bay Area has a mix of its foreign immigrants who are more heavily Asian and less heavily Latino, and LA vice versa. And on average, the Asian immigrant to the United States starts out with a higher level of education in the country of origin when they arrive here, and the average Latino shows it tends to be more rural in origin than the Asian, and therefore tends to have a lower level of education. So people, what they do is they knit that into an explanation. They say, well, see, basically LA took in a huge number of low-skilled people, and that drove the relative wages down, because what it did is it tilted the economy toward lesser skilled activities. That would be, by the way, you see this in a gazillion articles in the academic literature on migration and economic development. In the research that we did in this project, we basically reject that point of view. And I want to explain why we reject it. Okay, why we don't think that it was the labor supply that drove this difference. I'm going to argue in a minute that it was actually the quality of opportunities, not the quality of people. And so there's a technical thing, just one little technical thing to understand here. If we were to explain a difference in income between the two regions by the kind of people that it took in, then you'd expect that to show up exclusively as a result of the proportion of different people with different levels of education. Or you'd expect the Bay Area to have more higher educated people and LA to have more lower educated people, but you wouldn't expect a given person with a given level of education or background to be paid differently in the two regions. Okay, so it's about proportion, but not about differences within a type of labor supply. This is kind of formal economics. I hope people are grasping the thought, but you'll see it in a minute in the figures, in the number. So what you want to do then, to see whether the supply drove the difference, we know the proportions are different. We know that the Bay Area took in more Asians and less Latinos, and vice versa for down here. But the question is, what happens to each group? And here's where the supply-driven explanation doesn't work. So this is all college graduates, both foreign-born and domestically born. And notice what happens that in the early days, college graduates are basically paid the same thing. But now you get a college degree and you go to the Bay Area, you're going to make more money. But that's true also of, say, foreign-born. This is all foreign-born, all the groups from every country. Notice that in the early days, roughly similar, but there's a huge difference for foreign-born going to the Bay Area. But notice that, say, highly educated immigrants. So some of our immigrants come with college degrees. But you're an immigrant with a college degree, you're going to have much higher wages in the Bay Area than LA. What about if you're Hispanic? Right? Well, same thing. In the early days, your wages would not have been very different. Now, they're hugely different. So there's a lot more evidence in the book, a lot more detail, but just sort of think about it this way. If you were to take, I don't know, let's pick some kind of person. Let's say a 30-year-old male from Mexico with a high school education who immigrated 5 years ago. And we take this person and we clone him. And we put one of them in the Bay Area and one of them in Southern California. This identical person, or what the data show is this identical person will do a lot better in the Bay Area than they will down here in Southern California. And what that, in other words, is showing what that's showing is that it's not principally the supply, but rather the quality of opportunities that you give to any kind of person, any way you slice it, any kind of person will do better in the Bay Area in the last couple decades than down here. So we came to the conclusion that yes, supply of course enters into it, but it's not the thing that threw the switch of divergence. It's something about the quality of opportunity. Now, so then we have to turn to that. That's sort of the next subject in my talk is what happened to the industries in the two regions? Why did they go down such different pathways? And this is actually the core thing that in my home academic discipline of economic geography is what we try to understand, is why did different countries or regions, why do they do what they do? Why does New York have the finance industry, and why did Detroit have cars, and why is Silicon Valley where it is? So it's actually quite a hard thing to explain. There's no magic wand explanation for the landscape of economic activity. You have to think about a lot of different things that interact. And one of them might just be good luck and bad luck. In fact, early in the project, when we did interviews around Southern California, many of our interviewees, which you can see quoted in the book, we have a list of all those who authorized us to quote them, and we have quite extensive quotations. There's a pretty strong, we might say, folklore about good luck and bad luck. That, down here we just kind of had a lot of bad breaks, and up there they got a lot of good breaks. And certainly, luck is part of economic development. It's not all predictable. And it's kind of interesting to think about some of the good luck, bad luck stories, I think. So one of them has to do with Silicon Valley. And typically, people say the reason that Silicon Valley is where it is because Fairchild Semiconductor in 1972 made a better chip than anyone else had made up to that point. And I'm going to come back to that because LA made a lot more chips than the Bay Area in the early 1970s. And another thing is we sent the first internet message out of UCLA. But actually, Fairchild's chip wasn't that revolutionary. The thing that was sort of striking about it is that it was a simple chip. The complex chips were made down here by the defense companies. What they did is they made a cheap and easy one. And then the other bad luck story for us down here is aerospace. I mentioned this, and we did take a hard hit with the loss of aerospace, which was out of our control. It was done by Washington. It had to do with the end of the Cold War, and it also had to do with a change in the politics so that the senators and from other states got onto the fact that we had a good thing. And they picked away at the defense companies to get pieces located in their states through the congressional earmarking and log rolling system that we have. But so how much does that account for our fate? It accounts for precisely 2.37% of the 30% gap that opened up. That shocks people. Because actually, aerospace employment, the numbers that left were relatively modest. And when you calculate them and you calculate all the knock-on effects, it really doesn't give you an explanation. The failure of our economy is much more widespread than just the aerospace hit, although that was important. There's another good luck story for the Bay Area that people, when we tell legends about the high-tech economy, as they say, it's because, I don't know if everyone knows this, but the semiconductor was invented by a man named William Shockley. William Shockley invented it in New Jersey. He worked for Bell Laboratories, which was the in-house R&D facility of the telephone monopoly, American Telephone and Telegraph, and they had their research labs in New Jersey. He invented the semiconductor in 1954. But by the early 1960s, he decided to move out to Menlo Park, which is in Silicon Valley. And he moved out there, so he said, because his mother was aging and he wanted to be near her. So he took with him 8 of his closest collaborators, which were, we might say, the top hotshots in IT at that time. And they all moved out to Menlo Park. And it's kind of an accident, right? You could say, well, it's because his mother was there, and that's why Silicon Valley is where it is. And there's another great part of the story, which is that William Shockley had a reputation for being a pretty nasty piece of work. This is well documented that he was very rude to people, and often publicly rude. So he had a habit, for example, of yelling at people in public and calling them names, including his closest collaborators. This is not a good thing to do when you work, in a work environment. And indeed, what happened is that on one day, all 8 of his close collaborators quit. And it's called Shockley's Massacre. And this actually turned out to be very good luck for the Bay Area, because those 8 people turned out also to be those who would go on to do many of the key startups in the early Silicon Valley. And there might actually be sort of like a good luck story there. But all in all, what I want to now suggest to you is that plays a part in it, but I'm going to show you that it's not just good luck and bad luck. It's also about the kind of environments in which the economy was developing in the 1970s. And let me just talk for a minute about the 1970s and why 1970s don't just show up because we found this number of per capita personal income that diverges. It's widely admitted when we study economic development that the 1970s were a critical decade. They were the decade when what we call the old economy gave rise to the new economy. That means, broadly speaking, in the US, when manufacturing peaked and when these new industries started to become important. And that's the technology revolution around IT, It's the finance revolution, because that's basically when we exploded the old banking sector. They said, banking used to be a boring industry. It's not boring now. It's the core of the economy, for good or for worse. And that happens in the 1970s. It's also the beginning of the globalization era that we're in. That's exactly when you see an uptick in trade. So uptick in trade, uptick in migration, uptick in financialization, uptick in technology. And so the old economy dies and the new economy starts being born. And so this is the period we're talking about. And so what we did is we dug deeper. We said, let's look at the key sectors in our regions. So IT and biotech, which are key new economy sectors. And let's look at finance, let's look at logistics and trade, and let's look at aerospace. And see, when you have this changing environment of the new economy coming on, how did the firms and the business leaders and the workers in the two regions react to that change? And that's where we find the systematic differences. In fact, we find very different what we call institutions, or ways of generating economic activity in the face of this changing environment. So let me tell you a few things about that. What lies behind this? You could say that there's two kinds of institutions in an economy. One is formal ones. Government, for example, is an institution. Government has laws, it has rules, it has policies, it has programs. And we can sort of put our finger on them and measure them. And one thing you might ask is, well, was it the governments of the two regions that did things differently so as to drive the economy of one on a high road and to kind of let the other one travel a kind of medium or low road? That's one. And another, though, is institutions means something else. It means anything that is, we might say, highly repeated in an economy or a society. So an institution, for example, is having lunch at noon. There's actually no law that tells you should have lunch at noon. But people do it. And the reason you do it is because you learn to do it, and also because everybody else does it. And then lunch hour becomes what we call an institution, without having any kind of law or rule to tell you to do it. So there's actually, an economy in many ways. Some of the most important institutions are these informal ones that organize it. And for example, another one that's really important in economic development is, why don't most people cheat? Right? Part of it is because there's laws and they're afraid of being caught. But in lots of countries, there's laws and people are super corrupt. And then there's other countries where there are very low levels of corruption. And a lot of that, some of it has to do with formal law enforcement, but a lot of it also just has to do with whether you are in an institutional environment of not cheating. So we want to examine both of them. When we look at formal institutional outputs, what I mean here is local economic development policy, one thing we tried to do was to measure it. The problem that we ran into is that we have 15 counties and 200 and something cities. So we started with the idea that we would scrape all the data we could and measure what all these cities and counties had done to stimulate their economies and see whether there would be any differences. That, frankly, turned out to be infeasible because the data don't exist and cities keep terrible records of what they do, as it turns out. And they also mislabel. So like every time they fix a sidewalk, they put it in the economic development budget and tell you that was good for the economy. So you can't actually get a good picture of what we're doing for economic development. That's kind of a scholarly problem. I'm trying to think of something can do on that. But what we did do is we did a really detailed examination of public expenditures. So we could get budgets, and we got them for all the cities and all the counties. And we put them in categories, and we compared them. And we found a few differences. So for example, Southern California spends, as you might expect, less on transport and more on policing, more on public safety than Northern California. By the way, that's surprising because crime levels are no higher here than in the Bay Area. In fact, there's a lot of high crime areas in the Bay Area, but they don't spend as much on public safety as we do. I don't know what to make of that. But our conclusion was that beyond the different levels of public spending, meaning 25K per person there, 18 here, that you couldn't get into priorities. You couldn't find anything that would have thrown the switch of divergence from the policies of cities and counties. And part of that is because cities and counties are not set up to guide the long-term economic future of a region. There's no like czar of regional economic development in either of the regions. And most counties think about it, and we have things like SCAG where we try to talk about it, but there's no cohesive action. There's like a bunch of stuff we do. We build stuff and we do some tax incentives, but it's nothing that really you could say is we're going to guide the region one way or the other. So we kind of ruled that out as the explanation. And then we stumbled onto stuff that we found was interesting. So now I've been talking a long time and I'm going to finally give you an explanation. And here it is, okay? There's a Nobel Prize winning economist named Douglas North. So he wrote a book in which he said, beliefs are really important. That is, what you think about the economy actually has an effect on what you do in an economy. And we decided to look at the beliefs in the two regions. So we took 30 years of reports by the major regional business roundtables. So we took ABAG, Association of Bay Area Governments, we took Southern California Association of Governments, we took the Bay Area Council, we took the LA Business Roundtable, and a bunch of others. And we looked at what they say in their reports. And the nice thing nowadays is with IT, you can scrape all these things for the keywords they use, and then you can analyze them. And what we found is that in Southern California, there's hardly a mention of the new economy. Not back then and not even now. When you look at what the major organizations say about the economy, down here, it's radically different from in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, as early as 1982, ABAG and the Bay Area Council, they start to say, we have to change. We're expensive. The manufacturing's leaving. We can never go back to the past. We have to develop high-wage jobs for a high-cost region, and we're never going to get the glory days of big-time manufacturing back. In Southern California, the opposite happens. For decades, we continue to talk about about pushing our land prices down, about making our taxes lower, and that then we'll get all those great middle-class jobs back. So the discourses or the narratives, the stories that the region's leaders are telling about change are totally different. Now, and that, of course, is what happens with SCAG, is it puts all of its marbles on the port and the logistics industry, which was, by the way, a smart thing to do. It was intelligent to capture the China trade by developing our port. And, of course, they did a lot of things that were, I think, examples of very good concerted action, like getting the Alameda Corridor project pushed through. The big problem, though, is that it sucked up all the air, to put it bluntly. It's basically all they talked about. And the port and logistics industry is a low to medium wage sector. It's not a high wage sector. It never will be. It's big, but it cannot maintain the income position of our region. And so the problem is that they crowed about that success and forgot to talk about the other things that we needed to do. This was exactly the opposite to what happens in the Bay Area. So the Bay Area Council is the Bay Area private leadership organization. And they have a thing called the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. And the Bay Area Council Economic Institute gets on it early in the 1980s about what the new economy is all about. Now, the Bay Area Council, not only did it say different things, but it operated differently from any of our leadership organizations down here. So when I say operated differently, what I'm talking about is how much of the leadership community is drawn together in the leadership organizations, meaning how big of a tent are these organizations in the two regions, with the idea that in a big region, you need to draw together the principal interests and have them all be in the game of thinking about the economy. So there's long-term kind of folklore about how the Bay Area is more interactive, more coordinated, more sort of cohesive than we are. But is that just hearsay? We decided to test it. So what we did was, we did a thing that's now pretty common in economics and sociology, which is you take an organization and you see what kinds of connections people have. So for example, with the Bay Area Council, we looked and saw how many boards of directors the people on the Bay Area Council sit on that other members sit on, and how many, we might say, connections it takes to get from person A to person B. That's called a network analysis. Okay? And you can do it now we did all kinds of, the usual fancy statistical techniques. And I want you now to eyeball the two following slides. So this shows, in the two following slides, you're going to see the networks among the biggest corporations in the two regions in 2010 and see what the difference is. So you don't even have to think hard, this is just a visual. So here's the Bay Area, here's LA. Bay Area, LA. Bingo. LA is separate business worlds with no organizations that convene all of the major business groups together. And that shows up exactly in the statistical analysis. This is a wonky statistic called the n-betweenness ratio, which is basically telling you how many connections you have to go through to get to an average person. And all you have to see there is that the top organization in the Bay Area, the Bay Area Council, has 3 times the density of connections that our top organization, the LA Chamber of Commerce, has. And that after the Chamber in Southern California, there's nothing. Whereas there's a whole bunch of organizations in the Bay Area that are as good as the Chamber, and then the Bay Area Council on top of them. So we have a leadership structure. Not only do we say different things, but the Bay Area's leadership structure is different from ours. This is then confirmed. I'm going to go now fast, but this network thing is confirmed by other networks. When you measure entrepreneurship networks, and what we mean by that is when people start up firms in the two regions, how many other people are they likely to have started a firm up with and then to have joined in starting still another firm, and how many other people will they have had the experience of working with? When you measure it, you find 7 times greater level of entrepreneurial cooperation or successive spin-off through networks than down here in Southern California. Same thing shows up in what we might call civil society. The levels of social trust, you can measure this thing through statistics now, are very similar in 1970. They're much greater in the Bay Area now. Social trust has declined in Southern California. They have a much higher per capita level of philanthropic foundations, labor unions, community groups, and all that. And that's in spite of the rising mobilization of communities in Southern California that starts in the 80s and 90s and continues today. LA has become better at its community organizations, but they're still way behind in terms of the per capita resources that these organizations have to mobilize parts of the community to be participative politically. Okay, so now I want to give you, and this is I talked for a long time, but I want to give you 2 stories, okay, about how networks and connection, how when the new economy came along, the two regions basically reacted differently. And let's start with IT, okay, information technology. I want to remind people that at the beginning, LA had good endowments, meaning we had a lot of firms from the aerospace industry who were technological powerhouses. And the legends about technology in the 20th century, a lot of them are from LA. The key names are the inventiveness or something like that, of our entrepreneurs, the firms they created, the household names they created, that was LA in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. We had, as I said, extraordinary endowments in semiconductor design because starting in the 1950s already, they were incorporated into the guidance systems for airplanes and missiles, and the Pentagon funded them. We were way ahead of the Bay Area in making semiconductors for communication purposes. What happened, of course, is that our firms sort of got lazy because they had a luxury defense market, that they had a client, and they could serve it. What happened is that now up in the Bay Area, they also had some of this going on. Hewlett-Packard existed from 1938, and they also had a federal government client. But Fairchild, Hewlett, and Xerox saw opportunities to commercialize that for some reason were not picked up on down here in Southern California. And especially what happened was that the Xerox Corporation, which was a photocopying corporation coming out of New York, they said there's something going on there in this IT thing out in the Bay Area, and we'll set up a thing called the Palo Alto Research Center, or Xerox PARC. Now, Paul Duguid, he's a professor at Berkeley in the information school, but he was a technologist at Xerox PARC in the 70s. And we went and interviewed him, and he said, you must understand what happened at Xerox PARC. We said, well, yeah, but we read about it, and it's a lab, and you had a bunch of engineers, and they were innovating, and no particular, sort of important innovation came out of Xerox PARC. He said, that's not what came out of it. What came out of it was a network. And it was a strange network. He said, because it mixed the people from Berkeley with the people from Stanford, or as he put it, hippie academics and buzz-cut engineers. And now Hewlett and Packard, they were buzz-cut engineering types. They were Pentagon guys, very much in the mold of the engineers, and very similar to the people that we had in much greater quantity and much greater corporate power down here. The difference was, of course, this contact. And the contact between those kind of people and another kind of person who said, look, the deal is not to build airplanes and missiles anymore. It's to figure out how to commercialize all this stuff so that it becomes a new industry and transforms daily life. And of course, that's what happens. And you can find the confirmation for this point if you go on YouTube and you pull up Steve Jobs' graduation speech at Stanford in 2005. It's a long speech. Go right to the last 2 minutes on the YouTube. And what you'll find is that Steve Jobs says, and I want to tell you what really got us going in the early days of IT and made the Bay Area the world center of IT was this thing that we read called the Whole Earth Catalog. I bet nobody in this room knows what the Whole Earth Catalog. Oh, you do? Okay. Generational thing. Okay, we all know. Right. Okay, so for all you young people, Whole Earth Catalog was this large format, hard copy a document. It was a periodical that came out of the Bay Area, and it was the founding document for what was called the Appropriate Technology Movement in the 1960s. It was a thing basically done by Berkeley type of people. And it was all about reinventing technology to be simpler, but also to transform daily life with it. And Steve Jobs, at the end of his speech, he says, that's what really got me going in the IT thing, is I figured out that I could do appropriate technology with IT. And when they all came together at Xerox PARC, we convinced the engineers that that's where the opportunities were. And so basically, this is a story about two networks, two different communities that are networked in the Bay Area and that cross a boundary. And what they do is they transform the knowledge of both of them and make it into something new. And that's what didn't happen. And it mirrors the map of networks I showed you, is we had the engineers here, but no one ever got in to talk to them and say, you really could do something new, in spite of the fact that, like I said, the first internet message had been sent from the computer science department at UCLA in 1969. Now this story, and I swear I'm wrapping up, I know this has been long, this is the latest version of this kind of story. It's biotechnology. The science for biotechnology, that means cutting genes up, splicing them, it's developed actually simultaneously in the Bay Area and LA in the 1970s. It's at University of California at San Francisco and at City of Hope Hospital in Duarte. These are the key innovations happened simultaneously. Now, Stanley Boyer, who's from UCSF, he actually saw greater entrepreneurial opportunities down here in LA. And he said, I'm going to try, he said, the Bay Area is a really hard place to do business. Everyone's kind of a pain, and there's a lot of labor unions and very contentious politics. We'll go down to Southern California, which is more entrepreneurial and open. And he comes down here, and he does his first startup, which is called Amgen. And Amgen puts together a board of directors, which is shared between Caltech, UCLA, and UCSB. Amgen locates equidistant from all three of them in Thousand Oaks, western San Fernando Valley, and it quickly becomes the world's most successful biotechnology firm. However, in 1983, the scientists who are on the board of directors are excluded from management. There's an IPO with financing from Chicago. The professional managers come in, and Amgen becomes a conventional firm, big-time firm, very successful. Now, Stanley Boyer goes back to the Bay, and what he does is he finds a kind of a venture entrepreneur from the IT world, a young guy, 28 years old, and he creates Genentech. So Genentech is a new kind of firm. And Boyer says, we're not going to do like, that really went wrong in Amgen. I want the scientists to stay on the board in management in Genentech. And I want the managers and the scientists to mix it up. And I want the scientists to keep publishing papers and exploring new ideas. And what happened is he encouraged the people in Genentech to start up new firms. So Genentech becomes a new kind of business practice, which Martin Kenney from Davis calls science-based capitalism. And what we end up with is no big hit in the Bay Area. So there's no Amgen in the Bay Area. But what there is hundreds of biotech firms. We've had one IPO, that was Amgen 1983. They've had 67 in the Bay Area now. And they have a huge cluster, and we have one standalone firm. So this is exactly what mirrors the IT story. It's not about people and talent. It's about business practices and networks. And that's really where this long analysis comes down to. It's that paradoxically, LA, which is known for being so innovative and so kind of out of the box in terms of lifestyle and change, LA has become a conservative business culture. It was a revolutionary, experimental, inventive business culture from up to 1970. But it had all these game-changing leaders. But since then, the LA Times put this headline on this editorial I wrote. They invented it. They said LA lost its mojo. But I really do think that's what the analysis shows. That there's something about the worldviews where we had a model of success here that worked. It was big firms, it was large-scale development, but when the new economy came along, we never learned how to turn to this more relational, more flexible, or what people call sort of ecosystemic way of doing things. And the Bay Area lucked out because they brought together people from different worlds who pushed each other out of their comfort zone, and that's how they created the Bay Area way of doing business. So our two regions, we don't do business the same way anymore, and it's to our disadvantage. So the story here is, well, we need a new conversation, right? We need a new relational infrastructure here. It has to go from the leaders, that's the elites, but it has to go obviously all the way down into all the other communities. It has to be regional. That means it has to be Inland Empire, Orange County, and LA, like the Bay Area. But it also has to bring together different kinds of people, and it has to have some kind of staying power. That's not an easy policy recommendation to make, but I think it's probably the task that lies before us. And we've seen in the past that other regions have done it. If you'd been in 1960 and someone would have guessed which of these regions is really successful, Detroit or Boston, everyone would have said Detroit. Detroit was a rich, technologically dynamic, industrial powerhouse, immensely prosperous, right? And Boston was a loser in 1960. Old declining mill industries, class conflict, a disintegrating environment. You fast forward, and we know that what happened in Boston is that the governor of Massachusetts in the 1980s, Mike Dukakis, he put together a growth cabinet. He put all the sort of parties at the table and said, I'm going to make you talk to each other until we get through this. And of course, in Detroit, the opposite happened. Everyone went their own way when hard times arrived, and it was into a spiral of decline. So there are parallels, and that's the task before us today. The task is we have to get a conversation going. All the specific policy kind of mechanisms, we can do them once there is a sense that we know what the region, what our sort of collective project is, what our destiny has to be together. I'm very sorry, these talks always go on too long. I try to, but I'm very verbose. So thank you very much for listening. I'd be really happy to respond and debate.
The following programming is made possible through a generous donation from Randall Lewis, Executive Vice President of Upland-based Lewis Operating Companies.